Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's get started. We'll go to the Lord in prayer, ask His blessing for this morning's study, and then we'll begin. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for these beautiful Sunday mornings, and we're looking forward to the spring and the warm weather, Lord. It is a beautiful day. The sun is shining, and we're so blessed that we, this morning, freely open your word. So open your word, or open our hearts and minds to your word this morning as we study through the book of 1 Samuel. Lord, continue to help us to apply these things to our lives through your Spirit as He teaches and guides us, so that we can carry these things with us throughout the work week, Lord. So I just pray for all the many beautiful, wonderful truths and applications we are learning, Lord. I pray also always continually for us as individuals for our growth, but also that we grow as a church body as well together, individually and together as a group, Lord. So just bless us this morning. Lord, give me the words, and I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we'll do our normal review, which once again sets our minds in remembrance of what we studied last week, and then we will move on to the new material after. So let's review first, and then we'll move on to the notes. So I think after the review, I'm going to read our section. We'll read our section in totality and then move on. Okay, last week, if you remember, we tracked David's movements as he left Gath following a near-death experience in the court of Achish. Now, David fled to a well-known local cave system near the Judean city of Adullam. Now, Adullam was a city conquered by Joshua and the one army during the conquest. It was situated in an area of the land called the Shephelah. Another word for the Shephelah is the Judean foothills there. Of course, the area of the Shephelah has hills and valleys, plenty of valleys that exist in between those. We have the valley of Sorek, which is where Samson grew up. We have the valley of Elah, where that occurred. This is all in the Shephelah. Now, in Genesis 38, it was a city in southern Canaan. That was the setting for those odd stories about Judah, not the tribe, the person Judah, and his daughter-in-law Tamar. Now, we talked about this story, but what was the story's importance? In other words, why did Moses all of a sudden add this odd story about Judah? Well, this was the family line of the Messiah. Obviously had extreme importance to us and to Israel. Anyway, when David's family found out that he was hiding in these caves, which was in this area of Adullam, where the setting of Judah and Tamar occurred, they loaded up a caravan and they traveled from Bethlehem to visit. And on this visit, David decided to protect his parents from the ire of King Saul, really not trusting him and not knowing what he might do to his family, specifically his elderly parents. So before David did anything, other people began to show up at the cave. Now, the author last week, and we read in verse 2, says that everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him, David, and he became captain over them. Now there were about 400 men with him. Saul, we studied, he's spiritually bankrupt. He's in big trouble. We know that. And he's now working really against God himself. He is trying to kill an innocent David to keep the throne. He is a bit mentally ill. He is impulsive. We also talked about how he only acts when he is assured victory. But what we find out in verse 2 is that he is not running the kingdom very well. In other words, there is a possibility that he could be all those things, but actually be a pretty decent leader. Maybe economically, Israel was in decent shape. But we find out that that's actually not the case. There was a lot of trouble. He's not running the kingdom very well. So people flocked to David for various reasons. And that include the Hebrew word in there about debt, economic ruin. There was some trouble economically with some of the people who were under Saul's rule, especially here in southern in the southern part of the nation. But more importantly, there is a group of fighting men who pledge their allegiance to David's cause, and these men will become David's mighty men. A very, very important group of men who God uses to protect David during this time. This group will accomplish great things under David's banner and, of course, with God's blessing. Now, by the time David takes his mother and father from the cave of Adullam to Moab, there are about 400 men who make David their captain. So with a small army, David takes his mother and father east around the far side of the Jordan River to the king of Moab. And you know, Moab is on the southern side of the Dead Sea, the very south portion of the Dead Sea on the eastern side of the Jordan. But why Moab? Because David has family there from his great-grandmother Ruth. Apparently, the king of Moab had a good relationship with David. Of course, he's the enemy of Saul in some sense. And the king of Moab agrees to look after David's parents. And now David is free to travel knowing that his parents are safe. But David does not travel back to Judah. Rather, he takes his men to a place called the Stronghold. Now, there is much speculation as to where the Stronghold is located, but the most likely place is on the east side of the Jordan River, either in Moab itself, and if you go out of Moab and you travel a little bit north, still on the east side of the Jordan and the other side of the Dead Sea, which is modern Jordan. If you travel up and down that coast on the other side of the Dead Sea, you get into the tribal territory of Reuben or even Gad. If you go a little further north. So the stronghold may have been located someplace in and around there. We just know wherever it was, the author makes it apparent that it was not where the Lord wanted David to be. The Lord contacted a prophet named Gad, who most certainly came from Samuel's school, and he was sent to the stronghold to give David a message. The message was simple: do not stay in the stronghold, depart and go into the land of Judah. And last week we talked about why. Why could this possibly be the case? Why did David need to return to Judah? Well, first, I think the Lord would use David's own tribe to protect him. It was the Lord's will that David would stay in the land. All right, and so he was to go back to the land. He was to be in his tribal territory of Judah for protection. Second, God is teaching David to trust him. Staying in the land, even his own territory, we'll look at it today, would put David and his men at risk and would force them to seek God's protection at all times. He might have been a lot more protected on the east side of the Jordan. Once he crossed over, all right, and it was a bit more dangerous for him. God was going to use this time period, I think we should think of it this way, to shape and mold his king. He would grow David during this time. Now, for us, this is the same type of shaping and molding we experience as we go through those dark valleys in times of trouble. There's not much of a difference here as God works amongst his people to grow us, to shape us, to mold us, to strengthen our faith. And so David is going to go through that. Get back into the land, get back to your tribal territory, and trust me. Now, these dark valleys produced many of our favorite psalms, as maturing David exhorts us to trust in the Lord. Now, when Gad visited David, he was depending on a physical, what we talked about, the Hebrew word matsud. So that's what this fortified location was a matsud. But David the psalmist explains that the Lord is his matsud. Right? The Lord is his, a more literal translation is fortress. The Lord is his fortress, his matsud. What can mere man do to him? So this is David's point in the Psalms as he's grown. So let's continue with our story by reading the rest of chapter 22 as we move on and see what happens after verse 5. So the first 5 verses, we have David told to go back and go back to Judah, and he goes to the forest of Hereth, And here we have the rest of the chapter, the rest of the story. So I'm going to read verses 6 through 22. Of course, you can follow along in your Bibles in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 6 through 23. We are going to go over that in your notes as well. So let me read that. Sometimes I don't do this, but I like to give us a nice bird's eye view of what happens the rest of the chapter. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 22, starting out in verse 6. David is back in the land. He is in some place called the Forest of Hereth. And meanwhile, ... here we go. All right, verse 6. Then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjaminites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is to this day." Then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, answered and said, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all of his father's household, the priests who were in Nob. And all of them came to the king. And Saul said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of the Lord for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is to this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of his household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. But the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household." And the king said to the guards who were attending him, "Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me." But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, "You turn around and attack the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, furthermore, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep. He struck it with the edge of the sword. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to David. And Abiathar told David that Saul killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me.'" Now let's go back, and I just want to break down the first 3 verses here of our section. So if you want to look back in your notes, top of page 1, let's first break down the first 3 verses here, verses 6 through 8, and I read again. Then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with a spear in his hand, and all his servants were around him. And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush as it is to this day. Now, when we entered this section, I said the first 5 verses here were about David, and now the narrative changes, almost like we're getting the word meanwhile, ... At the same time, this is going on with David, from the first 5 verses, Saul is getting wind of all these things. Saul, through his network of spies, obviously knows that David is indeed back. Large contingent of men are now following David. These are things that Saul knows. This has started him on this diatribe of his, on what I call a pity party. So obviously, the news, once he heard it, has totally disturbed Saul's peace of mind. Saul wanted David dead so badly it has become an all-consuming obsession that really, basically, in this chapter we read, turns into tragedy, unfortunately. In verses 6 through 8, Saul is thrown what we might call a good old-fashioned pity party. Now, as I read this section, thinking about human nature and what we know of Saul, I can't tell if this is just the ravings of a man mentally ill and obsessed, which probably is true, or a calculated speech used to elicit an emotional response and some sort of reaction, right? Either way, Saul's going to lay it on thick here. And we might want to take the tack that Saul's doing a little bit of both. He is obviously not mentally well. He's obsessed, obviously, with David and holding on to the kingship. And this is an obsession. But there is a little bit of tactician in him. There's a little bit of calculation in his words. He's done this before to elicit an emotional response. So either way, you can read through this section, you see Saul is off his rocker here. And it's not good. So the author tells us first that Saul knows what David's doing. That's the first verse there. The first sentence there. And then it talks about where Saul is. So the author tells us first that Saul is in Gibeah. And this is his capital city that lies about 5 miles north. We're going to look at a map, 5 miles north of Jerusalem, in the tribal territory of Benjamin. Of course, you can refer back to the map. We're going to go back and forth to that map, and the guys will pull the map up for you too if you want to look up here. But that's so he's at his capital. He is not in his courtroom or his palace, which he holds court there too as well, but on a hill in the area of his hometown. Now, the word Gibeah does mean hill. More than likely, this town was situated on a hill of some sort. Remember, this is the Shephelah. This has a series of hills and valleys. A lot of towns were built on hills, so they'd be raised up, especially center city, those parts of towns where the important buildings were. The palace of a king or a local leader would exist on a hill. So he was more likely, Gibeah means hill, but it might have been the same hill that the center city was, or it could have been a local hill in the area. We don't know. But he's not in his palace. He is sitting in what has become a customary place in which he holds court, where he also met and deliberated with his men during the mild winter months. So more than likely, when it is mild, the weather's mild, he would sit outside here. His customary seat was described as situated under a tamarisk tree on the height. Now, a tamarisk tree, or the word eshel, they would call an eshel tree, is a slow-growing tree that is perfect for surviving the harsh desert regions. So it's just one of those trees that are in the Middle East that can grow and thrive in that climate. And there's a picture, obviously, you have in your notes of the eshel tree and what it looks like. It has very thick leaves that provide great shades for those under it. And so if you take a look at it, that is pretty thick leaves. Of course, it's not leaves like an oak tree. You see it has those like thistles type needles, but it's very, very thick. Now, in the morning hours, just like it does on our grass, right, thick dew collects amongst those leaves so that it also has a cooling effect. So if you sat in this tree in the cool of the morning, you would get cooled off by the moisture that the tree collected. And you get the shade and you get the cooling effect. Really cool. Now, in Genesis 21:33, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba after he made a covenant with Ahimelech. And so the tree has great symbolism, as a lot of other trees in Israel have great symbolism. Well, trees and fauna and plants, and usually because of Israel, it counts all these things as God's blessing. Pomegranates and other fruits have great symbolism, and tamarisk tree is nothing new here. Now, before I want to move on here, I did have a question from Mary, and I had a redirect. So I want to look, can you bring up the map real quick for me?
I don't see a map on here.
No, the map it should be, oh, I didn't put a map there?
I don't see one.
Oh, I apologize. All right, if you look on your maps, you can see Benjamin. Everybody see that? Now remember that the land of Israel is the size of New Jersey, right? And so if I were to look at that little sliver of land that exists that says Benjamin there on your maps, it's probably the size of a local county, Atlantic County or something. I mean, this is the size we're talking about. Can you see below Benjamin, you see the city there, it says Gibeah. So this is where Saul is sitting, right? Right there, and right now as we speak in our text. And so the reason why I'm going over this is there was a sense in which Mary was asking me, Jim's Mary, where is Saul, where's David, and how close are they to each other, and what's the deal here? Saul is sitting in Gibeah, and as you go 5 miles south, I mean almost directly south, what city do you see? Jerusalem. Does that exist inside the territory of Benjamin, or is it in Judah? Take a look at the line. Benjamin. So understand that Jerusalem, Jabus, originally and from the Canaanite language, was a city given to the Benjamites. Jerusalem is thought to be a Judean city, but it's a city of Benjamin. Now, obviously, David will make it his capital, and eventually all of Judea took Jerusalem, especially when the kingdom divided, that became a city of Judah. But originally, it was a city of Benjamin. And when you passed Jerusalem to the south, you then entered into the tribal territory of Judah. And the first city, major city you hit of any importance is Bethlehem. You see that about 5 miles even past Jerusalem. And if you travel a little bit southwest, you will hit Adullam. Can you see Adullam? Everybody locate it a little southwest, see Adullam. And so David is in that area. There is plenty of distance between David and Saul, but just understand that if this is New Jersey and Benjamin is Atlantic County, it's not like they're 50 to 70 miles away, okay? They're anywhere from a dozen to 12 to 15 miles distance from each other. Yeah, I mean, it's not really... Again, let's take the context. If it was nowadays, right, Saul would get into an armored tank with his army and within a couple of hours would have stormed David, you know. So things are different back then. 15 miles is different. Now Saul could get into his SUV with a couple of his gunmen and they could find David pretty quickly and probably, you know, have him surrounded within, 15 minutes, a mile a minute, maybe 20, depending on the terrain. All right, so it's a little bit different here, but it is, as far as mileage-wise, David's not in a foreign land, all right? And David's in his own tribal territory, a little south. All right, everybody good with that? That's a map. All right, just wanted to put it in context. Where's David? Where's Saul? Of course, David's traversing on the other side of the Dead Sea as well by this time as well. But that's the idea. All right, so let's get back here to the tamarisk tree and its shade. And here, Abraham starts the ball rolling. Of course, Moses tells us that Abraham, after this covenant with Abimelech, Abraham plants a tamarisk tree. So he plants it in Beersheba. Now, remember, the area of Israel is from Dan in the far north to Beersheba. So where is Beersheba? All the way to the very, very, very south. the very south of Israel's territory. Beersheba is one of the last cities you'll hit before you get into Egyptian territory. And so from Dan to Beersheba. So that's the very south. And Abraham was there in Genesis 21. You can read about that if you'd like to go back. And he planted a tamarisk tree. Therefore, in Israel, the tamarisk tree became a representation of God's provision, his endurance. This is a tree of endurance and protection, shade, as it were, is the symbolism here. Now, it may have been Saul's favorite tree, because the valiant men of Jabesh Gilead took the body of Saul down from the wall of Bet-Shen, right? And now I got time out. Let me review. Do you guys know about Saul and Bet-Shen and Jabesh Gilead? Because if you don't, let's do a little reminder here. We got to go back to the book of Judges, all right? Remember, there was a war with Benjamin. Jabesh Gilead was the only town that did not send warriors to fight against Benjamin. Right? And so the whole of Israel, in the book of Judges, rises up against Jabesh Gilead and is going to destroy it. I'm sorry. They're going to rise at it first. They're going to try to destroy Benjamin. They promised that they wouldn't marry any of their wives or women, their daughters, to any Benjamite. But the Benjamite tribe was going to go extinct. So they said, which town or city didn't join us against Benjamin? And it was the town of Jabesh Gilead. So they went and they took all these daughters, these women, these young virgins from Jabesh, and they married them to Benjamites. So we fast forward into the time of Saul, right? Saul has relatives in Jabesh Gilead. The mothers, the Benjamite mothers, were Gadites, right? Many of them, because they used the women of Jabesh Gilead to populate or repopulate the tribe of Benjamin. So Saul more than likely had a grandmother or a great-grandmother who came from Jabesh Gilead. So how does that come into context with our book of 1 Samuel? Oh, you remember when Saul was a young king and he was trying to establish himself. He wasn't probably nationally recognized yet. And an evil king called Nahash, you remember that guy, he attacked Jabesh Gilead. And what did Saul do? He cut up his oxen, remember, sent it to the tribes of Israel and said, if you don't follow me, we'll do this to you. And you remember that story. And so Saul comes to the rescue. He gathers men together and they go fight Jabesh Gilead. Why does Saul do that? Well, of course he's trying to establish himself, but he has relatives in Jabesh Gilead. So there's this great correlation and tie-in between the tribe of Benjamin and the city of Jabesh Gilead, which is a bunch of Gadites. And so they had this kind of like family relation here between these things. So I'm going to give you a spoiler alert, because if you don't want to hear, cover your ears and say, la, 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 I'm sorry. Well, I'll tell you again that Saul and his sons get killed. It's one of the last things we're going to study in this book. They end up dying, right? The Philistines took Saul and his sons' bodies. They chopped off their heads. You know, they parade that around. But they took that, and at this point in time, at the end of our book, the Philistines controlled the city of Bet-Shen. And guess what? Pastor George and I and George and Sharon visited Bet-Shen when we were in Israel. And that was the picture that we had showed you, where there was a whole bunch of ruins in between the area where you came into the archaeological area, and there's all these ruins, and then there was a tell at the end. And I told you that I ran through all the ruins and I ran up the tell and I took a picture. More than likely, the center city, Bet-Shen, was on that tell. That's where the city was. Bet-Shen is a little south of the Jezreel Valley, but far north above the territory of Benjamin. So Bet-Shen was actually, at the end of our book, was actually controlled by the Philistines, believe it or not. They had made headway into Israel. So they took Saul's body and his sons, and they put it, and they shamefully put them on the walls of Bet-Shen. So what happened is this amazing story of the men, the valiant men of Jabesh Gilead, who snuck to the city of Bet-Shen, through the Philistine ranks, took the bodies down, and then brought those bodies of Saul and his sons to Jabesh Gilead, because it was a shame. And David, being the enemy of Saul, though honored the men of Jabesh Gilead. David saw the valiant men. He recognized them. Even though Saul tried to kill him, David later on said, these men, these valiant men, are to be honored. All right, so that's the idea here. Well, why would I think that this is Saul's favorite tree? It says that the men of Jabesh brought Saul's body back to Jabesh and buried his bone under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh Gilead. That's where Saul was buried. That's where his bone lay, under one of these trees. Now, many leaders have these type of places where they would hold meetings. We've seen this before. In our book, a book study of the book of Judges, before she helped Barak, Deborah used to sit under a palm tree, and she would render judgments for Israel. If you look at Judges 4:5, it talks about that. So Deborah's tree of choice was a date palm, and we were there, right? How many date palms did we see, George, Sharon, right? Tons of them. So she would sit under one of these trees. And so local leaders would sit under trees. They would provide local landmarks, shade. It was a very harsh climate. Now, because the king, well, I'll say this. The bottom line is that Saul was in his usual outdoor place where he would often hold court and strategize with his military men. He would strategize here if he was going to war. And this tree was on top of a local hill in the area of Gibeah. That's the idea. And because the king is now upset with David, I say that this meeting turns into nothing more than a pity party. He's not consulting them in any way. All right, he's complaining. Now, once again, notice that Saul does not carry the usual royal scepter, right? He carries, as a symbol of authority, a spear. Right? Not a royal scepter. His royal scepter is a spear, an instrument of war, and maybe an indication of his paranoia. And so it's very interesting that this is constantly reminds you that he's sitting under the tamarisk tree on the height with a spear in his hand again. And this is maybe, again, a symbol of his paranoia here. Now, the author also gives us some other details that I find interesting. It says the author says that his servants were all around him. Now, we get confused because, again, we should not think of these men as household servants. That's not the idea here. Of course, he undoubtedly had plenty of servants that served him in the palace and did things for him. No doubt. But that's not what the author is telling us here. This is not his household servants. Rather, these were his court advisors. This was his governmental and military leaders. If Abner wasn't out on a military excursion at this point in time, look, Abner, the captain of his army, was more than likely at this meeting. So he is surrounded by his court advisors, his military men who are with him in this area. Not his household servants. Now he begins to address them with a well-known Hebrew word, Shema. Shema. Now 2 weeks ago, I was kind of in Deuteronomy study with Pastor Jim, and we were talking about Shema. And words have meaning, and they're very important. My father has been going over words with you guys. If you come out to Thursday study, how important the nuance of these words are. If you translate the word Shema, it could be hear or listen. I mean, okay. But remember that Shema means not only to audibly hear with your ears. Like, hey, I want your attention. That's not what Shema means. Like, hey, I'm trying to get your attention and hear the words audibly. You know, it's not that flat. All right? There's something much more to the idea here. It's to listen, understand what I'm saying, and then to obey or to react to whatever the information I'm giving you. Couldn't be necessarily, maybe not necessarily just obey, but hear what I'm saying, understand it, and then kind of pivot and change your thinking in your mind and react. That's the idea of Shema. Now, I've had many serious talks with students where I wanted them to understand that I was not mad at them, but I simply wanted to correct their behavior for their own good. So I would say something like this. Like in English, it's not encompassed in one word. It's more like a phrase. And you've done this probably with your children, so you can understand what I mean. How many times have you started a conversation like this? I wanted to talk to you, but listen very closely to what I'm about to say to you. Did you ever start a conversation with a son or a daughter that way? I want to talk to you, but now listen very carefully, because I don't want you to mistake what I'm saying to you. When a Hebrew used Shema, he was calling on his fellow countrymen to listen very closely to what he was saying and understand his meaning. Don't get this wrong. A basketball coach enters the locker room at halftime and gets his players' attention by yelling, "Listen up!" And when that coach says, "Listen up," he wants his players to listen to every word he's going to say because he's going to make some halftime adjustments, right? We all get this. We have children and all that. That's Shema. This is listen. I want you to understand. Pay attention. There's another one. Pay very close attention. When a king uses Shema, it is more of a command to carry out orders and understand the point the king is making. In other words, he was trying to persuade him, there's no doubt about that, with some logic, with some reasoning, but he was also speaking from a position of authority here. So when the king says, Shema, Shema na, listen now, hear now, this is not just a plea, but an insistent that they accept and obey what he is about to say to them. So what serious thing is he going to say or accuse or give them? What information is he passing along? But what I want you to do before we go over that, I wanted you to notice something else. He addresses them as Benjamites. Benjamites. Well, why is that? And why is this important for us to kind of see in here? It's only one word, Benjamites. Well, let me explain to you what that means or why that is given to us by the author and why Saul addresses them. An important detail, this has to do with tribalism. This is a very, very important detail of tribalism. Almost 100% of his government was made up strictly of men from his own tribe. That's who they were. They were Benjamites. There wasn't a lot of Judeans. There wasn't a lot from the tribe of Gad or Issachar in this group. And we know that Doeg the Edomite is there. He's an Edomite. He's not a Benjamite. But I can guarantee you almost every single person amongst his servants were all Benjamites. In other words, in tribalism, the tribe who held the kingship of Israel would have great benefit from the position. It wasn't really supposed to be that way. But the king would promote governmental and military men from his own tribe because they were the ones, why? Most loyal to him. If I'm a Benjamite king, all of my personal guards would be Benjamites. And David didn't do it that way, by the way. Not solely. I'm sure he had a lot of Judeans he trusted, including, some of his military leaders. But it wasn't supposed to be that way. Now, when that king would take fields and vineyards for himself in his courts, which I remind you was an action told to them by Samuel, they would be given to the men of his own tribe. The king is supposed to be a servant of all people and subservient to God. That was what the mandate, let's use that, set out by God. A servant of all the people, and he was supposed to be subservient to God. And we see that Saul was favoring his own tribe, and it's a detail of tribalism. He was wrong in doing it, but of course it's the detail of what tribalism did when you held your tribe and gave them this kind of extra favor, and which wasn't a good thing. So anyway, Saul missed the mark. Saul obviously missed the mark that we see set out by God in Samuel earlier in our book. He is self-serving, and we also note that Saul is in total opposition to God. Total opposition to God at this point in time. Now, I wanted to review 1 Samuel 8, and this is what is said again, but I wanted you to notice that we could probably pick out a detail, specifically verse 14 and 15, in which Saul fell prey to. But let's look at that section again from 1 Samuel 8. This is Samuel himself speaking about what the king will do to you. You're asking for a king. Here's what will happen. He said, 1 Samuel 8, verse 11, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest, and to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. Now let's look at verse 14. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his Benjamite servants. All right? So fields were taken for the normal people and they were given to members of his own tribe. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give them to his officers, his Benjamite officers, and to his servants. They were Benjamites. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Now let's read Saul's address to these people and then talk about, and we're going to have these little additions in there to give us a little context. It gives us a much better context when we look at that and say, well, what is he saying to them? Listen, hear now, Shema na, oh, you Benjamin, you Benjamites. They were all mostly Benjamites, right? Get it? Will the son of Jesse give to you all these fields and vineyards? No. He will give them to his own tribe, Judah, and you will lose your status, is what he's saying to them. Now, it's not that saying that David will do that. This is what Saul is saying David will do. If he in some way has victory here, you're going to lose everything. Yeah, it reminds you of Washington, D.C. If this president gets in, we lose everything. Will he make you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Of course he won't. He will give those positions to his own tribes. All you military leaders will lose all of your rank. Saul uses what is the general practice of all kings as a way to sway his advisors in case there is any hesitation to spare David, or even if they feel that Saul is wrong and wanted David dead. And you got to understand, these Benjamite advisors of Saul, they're loyal to Saul, but they also can't see how he wants David dead. David is understood as a very loyal soldier, has done great things against the Philistines. He's held as a hero. And so even amongst these Benjamites, they might feel really good about David. I mean, they still hold him up as the young hero from the valley of Elah. He slew Goliath. And to them, he was a trusted, he's the royal family of Saul. So even they don't truly understand this. And Saul's making it clear that, hey, David wants me dead, and he's holding this pity party. And you know what? If he's successful, you lose. In other words, if David ever becomes king, they will get nothing. So it is in their best interest to keep the kingly line in their own tribe, as Saul is fighting so hard to do. Right? Do you get now do you get the address, what he's trying to say to them and how he's trying to sway them and how this is part of a pity party and a little bit of manipulation here. So I don't know if he's all stark mad here. I think there's a little manipulation. But Saul's not done, as he continues by basically accusing his own advisors of disloyalty, right? In a rant bordering lunacy or maybe, like I say, manipulation, Saul spews basically lies and exaggeration to make his men feel guilty. He is speaking in a bit of fear and self-pity. But again, I want to give him some credit, maybe in manipulation. He says this, listen, all of you have conspired against me. That's not true. As a matter of fact, not one of these advisors conspired at all. As a matter of fact, nobody, not even David, has conspired against Saul. Yeah, he certainly is. So that there is no one, he says, who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. Nobody but David and Jonathan really knew about the covenant. These advisors knew nothing of David's covenant with Jonathan. So you say to me, oh, well, deeds then, how does Saul know about it? Well, how would Saul know about it? Well, I would think that Jonathan had a very serious conversation with his father where he told his father, I will not kill David. I made a covenant with him. And I refuse to help you, Father. I will help you in your government. I will do what you say, but I will not touch the son of Jesse. And you're not going to make me do it. I have a covenant with him, I swore before the Lord. You know he told his father that, so he's well aware of it, and maybe whispers had gone around his court that David made a covenant with Jonathan and they were best friends, and of course these things happen. But they didn't know that David was making a covenant with Jonathan. They weren't there. They were not in any way privy to this, for this. And Saul probably knows this, or maybe he's mad, stark raving mad, and it's just an obsession. And then he says, and there is none of you who is sorry for me, boo-hoo, or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my enemy. Page 4, if I can get there. My servant against me to lie in ambush. Now, David has never laid an ambush for Saul, and we know when we look in the future, he doesn't. He could have killed Saul on a couple of occasions. He doesn't. Saul is out of his mind. David has and never has and never will ambush Saul. This is something he has in his own mind. Now, read the room as people are looking down at his feet. So I want to see you. We do this like where we make everything a movie, right? Saul is ranting. He's throwing out the guilt trip. He is pity partying. And I want you to see all his advisors is, looking down at their feet. You know how that is. And they're scuffing their feet. And, they're kind of like not looking the king in the eye. And some of them probably flat confused. Like, what is he talking about? Like, and maybe even some of them looking at each other, no, or you, no, this denial. But either way, there's shame here, right? And there's what it. Now, Saul, you've got to read the room, and because Saul reads the room, there's stunned silence. And then we have somebody who speaks up, all right? So they are confused. They have no answer for Saul because it's not true. There's nothing that they can say. They're embarrassed. There's stunned silence here. And all of a sudden, verses 9 and 10, then Doeg the Edomite, that street thug, who was standing by the servants of Saul, said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. He inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. That's verses 9 and 10. The street thug curries favor. Now Doeg sees a golden opportunity to curry favor with Saul. You can see his wheels turning in his head. Oh, here's his chance. He takes advantage of Saul's suspicions and quickly reveals that he, in fact, not like his unfaithful advisors, has some really beneficial words, information he wants to share, right? So he's making himself into a bit more faithful than these advisors. He saw David while he was at Nob, he reveals to Saul. And he tells Saul that he personally witnessed the high priest Ahimelech inquire of the Lord for David, as well as give him supplies and the sword of Goliath. And we know that 2 or 3 of those things are correct. And of course, the point of this exercise was to make himself appear valuable and loyal to King Saul, as opposed to these other high-ranking officials of Saul's court who were not as loyal as him. You see how he's pouring it on here? Now, in the next 7 verses we have, or the next 6 verses, we have Ahimelech, and then the serving priests are summoned and questioned. And so after Doeg reveals this information, curries favor, a pat in the back from King Saul, Saul's going to summon the priests. And it says this in verse 11. Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, listen now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, here am I, my lord. And Saul then said to him, why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me? There's the paranoia. In that you gave him bread and a sword and have acquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is to this day. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who among all your servants is faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of his household or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. But the king said, you shall surely die. Ahimelech, you and all your father's household. So King Saul, upon hearing this information from Doeg, not only summoned Ahimelech, but he also summoned the whole group of the serving priests of Nob. Now one has to wonder, just to wonder, I don't know, it's a speculation, if Saul knew he was going to execute Ahimelech, no matter what his response would be, and use this event as an opportunity to destroy the entire priesthood. I mean, it has to be considered. Possibly, why would he do that? To stop anyone else from inquiring of the Lord against him. And Saul's a smart guy. He is now against Jehovah. He is Jehovah's enemy. And he can't have anybody inquiring of the Lord against him. Did he summon Ahimelech and all of the priests there, knowing he's going to kill them all? I don't put it past this crazy king. But he summons them all. They all stand before him. Ahimelech and his whole household of 85 serving priests. Now, it was a bad sign that this address starts with, not as being addressed by his first name. You kind of get the context here, right? He calls him son of a high tub. That kind of knows you're in trouble. When a son is called by their father and they're called by their whole first name, usually you're in trouble. If I'm called David, I'm in trouble. If I'm called DG, it's a sign of affection, right? Not now. My father always calls me David, but, in the past. DG, I'm in good shape. If I'm called David, I'm in trouble. All right? It's just, David. So, He doesn't even say Ahimelech. He doesn't even address Ahimelech by his first name. He calls him son of a high tub, right? He's in trouble right now. So this we could sense the trouble. And Saul also uses the word Shema again to begin his question of Ahimelech. So he says, Shema na. Listen now. Shema na. All right. So he is now going to speak very candidly and seriously to Ahimelech. Saul accuses Ahimelech of aiding and abetting the enemy of the state, and most importantly, his enemy. That's what he's saying to him. You aided and abetted my enemy, David. And this is where I conclude that David's status before King Saul was not common knowledge. I've kind of stressed that at this point in time. And I said to you that the priesthood didn't even know. Now, I don't think Ahimelech here is trying to save his own bacon. I don't agree. I think Ahimelech is completely surprised here. He has no clue what the king is talking about. He might have had a clue as he marched to Gibeah and might now have a clue that he's in trouble, and it might involve David. But before this whole thing, he didn't know what the deal was. So I think that he is totally not being just saving his bacon, being protective. I think he's being completely honest and just caught by surprise. And what I think is genuine surprise, Ahimelech explains that in his mind, David is known as the most trustworthy and faithful man in all of Saul's kingdom. As a matter of fact, David is a member of the royal family. Now, Ahimelech reasoned with Saul, and he's saying basically, David held such favor with you, O king, that he was promoted as captain of your guard and is held in the highest esteem among your old household. In other words, if he was an enemy, why is he promoted? Finally, Ahimelech truly pledges, and I think in a series of very honesty, that he knows nothing about any of this. But the king has become a paranoid maniac, or maybe a calculated murderer. And he orders the death of not only Ahimelech, but the entire priesthood of Nob, which was 85 men. And the scary thing about all this is Saul gave the order without the least bit of fear of God. 85 men that were his men that he was required to protect. They were in his kingdom. They're his subjects. He truly reached a new low. Saul. No fear of God at all to kill priests of the Lord. Let's look at verses 17 through 19. And the king said to the guards who were attending him, these are these loyal Benjamites. Okay, listen to this. Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand is also with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me. But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, you turn around and attack the priests. And Doeg, the Edomite, turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And if it wasn't bad enough, listen to what he does. And this is under Saul's orders. This isn't Doeg going off. Understand. And he struck Nob, the city of priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep. He struck with the edge of the sword. A dark day in Israel. A dark day in Israel. The time of the Judges was a spiritually dark time in Israel's history. We entered our book in 1 Samuel during the time of the Judges with a broken priesthood and an odd situation with a priestly line from the family of Ithamar, not the authorized line of Eleazar serving in Shiloh. I think Samuel had a special ministry, and God used him mightily to bring the hearts of the people back to God. And there were some great moments in Israel's history during the time of Samuel. No doubt. Pockets of revival and proper worship and service. I think he led Israel as a spiritual God with honor. We honor Samuel. He had a good ministry. But the residue from the time of the Judges still stands. King David begins to make what is wrong with the priesthood and he puts it under the proper and blessed family of Zadok. He organizes the priesthood, and we get the temple with Solomon. So we could say that there was a spiritual revival in Israel under the wise, at least young, leadership of young Solomon with the newly built temple. And there were some great times there. But the point that I'm making, as this might not be the spiritual pinnacle for God's people at this point in time, but even Saul's own personal guards knew how wicked it was to slaughter innocent priests that belonged to the Lord. Notice how out of line the king is. These Benjamites who were absolutely loyal to Saul, and who would, you do not refuse the king, right? I mean, when the king said something, you did it. And these are his closest advisors. These are probably his personal bodyguard that protects Saul. And they said, no. They refused because they would now be an enemy of their God. So what I'm saying is as dark as a time as it is right now spiritually, even the crazy Saul couldn't get his own personal guard to slay these priests. This was an abomination. This was an evil act. And they want nothing to do with it. Now, we're not told what happens. Did Saul remove them from duty? Were they executed? We might not never ever know. We might know in heaven, but we can't know. Maybe that happened. I don't know. Maybe he declared them all enemy of the state themselves, threw them in prison. But they refused. Now, Doeg had no such scruples. He was an Edomite. For him, it was all about currying favor with Saul and what he could get out of serving Saul's kingdom. We see the political side of this, right? Of course, Doeg was more than eager to do this. Doeg was a thug who could care less about God's people or God's laws. Why do I say that? Doeg was at the sanctuary at Nob being held up for a couple of days. That means Doeg was following God's laws. This was part of the law itself. For whatever reason, he was there. Doeg had become, to serve Saul, had become part of Israel, had become what we might call a proselyte. So Doeg was supposed to be a part of God's people. The Gentiles were allowed to become part of Israel and then subject themselves to God's law. There were some restrictions for them, but otherwise they could serve and worship in a lot of ways. So Doeg, by serving Saul, became that. That's why he was held up at the sanctuary. But you could see by his actions, he could care less. He only did it because he had a position in Saul's government. He doesn't care about God's law, and he certainly doesn't care about God's people. Saul, who understood this, he has read the room, and he knows he can't get any of his people to kill these priests. He read the room. He's a smart cookie. He turns to Doeg and commands him to slaughter the priests, and Doeg was all too happy to oblige. This was a dark day in Israel because the current king has now demanded the slaughter of 85 innocent priests of his kingdom, and these subjects were priests of the Lord. They were directly serving the Lord. They belonged to the Lord, and it became a symbol of his war against Jehovah. If, and I think he already passed that point, there was a point of no return, it certainly was here. Could have been here. And King Saul used a foreigner with no scruples to accomplish this evil deed. Terrible thing. Now, to make this event truly tragic, Saul ordered the extermination of the entire priestly village of Nob. Saul basically put the town of Nob under the ban. Now, only God could order the ban. That is, only the priest, the high priest, and no other king could order the ban. So I meant this in a metaphorical way, not in a literal way. Saul basically put the town of Nob under the ban, as both men and women, children, infants, also oxen, donkeys, sheep, he struck with the edge of the sword. He commanded this of Doeg. Now, this may have been to make sure that nobody from Ahimelech's family might rise up and oppose him, or Saul could just be acting vindictive. But the man carrying out this order was an Edomite, a man from the ancestry of Esau. Right? He was an Edomite. Everybody know that. Edomites are from Esau. The very bottom of the Dead Sea, that's where the kingdom of Edom was. That's where where Doeg was from. And funny how this reminds us of another future maniac who refused to have anyone threaten his rule, Herod the Great, who slaughtered all the baby boys in Bethlehem to protect his throne from a rival. King Herod the Idumean, which generally was a Greek term meaning Edomite. The Herods were Edomites. Both Herod and Doeg came from the same bloodline. And so it's funny how years earlier, thousands of years earlier, another Edomite slaughtered a whole bunch of Israelites. Matter of fact, slaughtered a bunch of baby boys in the town of Bethlehem. Now here's one thing I'm going to close with. Interestingly, years earlier, Saul got into trouble for refusing to wipe out the entirety of the Amalekites and their animals. Remember that? But he had no such problems in chapter 22 with the household of Ahimelech. We get another view into the heart of Saul, as in his own mind, it did not personally benefit him to destroy all the Amalekites. Remember, he just didn't want to do it. He made his excuses, and it was the people, but it was him. It didn't benefit him. But there was great benefit in seeing that nobody from Nob would survive, right? And he made sure all of them died. And we're going to finish with the last three verses is what happens as a result of this. And I do want to start next week with what we're thinking about the divine plan in all of this, human choice with God's sovereignty, and this tragic event, and putting it in very good and very important doctrinal place as we look at what happens there. You can read what I wrote about that. We're going to finish these notes and go on to chapter 23, but we'll begin there next week. Sorry, I kept this long today, and I don't have any time for any questions or redirect. Sometimes I get into the trap of trying to finish all the notes, but probably not a good thing, just to go at our own pace. So thank you for your kind attention. Sorry to no questions. If you do have any redirect or comments you want to make, please see me in between services, and I certainly will address those things as well next week. Let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask his blessing for today. Dear Heavenly Father, we ask for that blessing, that you take the things that we are studying and help us to apply it to our lives, to see the truths, that it'll make an impact on us. And again, we will carry all the things we learn here through the lessons we do in adult Sunday school and our Sunday morning sermons, Lord, and just we're constantly looking at your word, and we're constantly seeing those truths. We're constantly applying those truths and thinking about those truths, meditating on your word throughout the whole week, Lord. So affect our hearts and minds this week. Help us to think through these things, Lord, and contemplate on the things that we do in our own personal studies as well. But we ask for your Spirit to guide us, direct us, and to grow us to maturity. And we ask all these things in Jesus'